of the most dire needs that we just partially cataloged, then you need about 0.5% of GDP as foreign aid coming from these 22 of the most developed countries of the world. But that does not include building infrastructure, disaster aid, a lot of other kind of contingencies as well as necessities. So if you factor all those things in, then the minimum percentage that you get is 0.7. So I want to emphasize this is really quite modest and really a minimum figure rather than something that would be a luxury for the world. It's actually a necessity for the world as we see it today.
Mm-hmm. And so that I understand this number, so we're talking about this is in direct aid. Does it include trade or other kinds of transactions that might happen between nations?
No.
Okay, so it's just direct aid.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So now in terms of microcredit, when you're dealing with, is it always business? It's always businesses in the case of Friendship Bridge?
Right. We actually call ourselves a microcredit plus organization.
Okay.
Because we recognize that credit alone won't solve all of the issues of poverty that with the population that we're serving. So we start, credit really is what attracts many of the women, and we focus on women. It's been proven throughout the microcredit industry that women are the focal point for a family in terms of who buys, food, shelter, clothing, and education. And so when women have a little bit of extra money to spend, they'll spend it on their families. So we focus on women.
What do men spend it on? We go to the track?
Lots of things. They
things that maybe we shouldn't talk about?
Right,
okay.
Right. This
there is
a family show.
Difference almost.
Right.
Yeah.
But and to your question,
so I threw you off.
You threw me off because
women tend to spend the money on their families, and so you found that's the most effective place to loan.
Right. No, to women, so yes, we've focused on women, and I've forgotten your question, so that's why.
That's okay. I forgot my question too.
Let me make an observation here. I think this is very good actually, and a good example of what the women can do if they actually are empowered. The problem comes partly from the social matrix in which the women are embedded. In Bangladesh, for example, and many other countries that I know, women still are dominated in patriarchal families. So sometimes what happens is that the woman gets the loan, but it's the man who really controls the money, and then the money is spent. So in addition to giving loans, I think we also need to be aware of and do something about changing these kind of power relations within family and inside the communities, which some of the NGOs especially are very concerned about and also are trying to do something about.
Right. Thank you, Haider. I do remember I was talking about microcredit and sort of the larger aspect. Microcredit is what draws many of the women in. But when they've come to repay, and they could come twice a month to repay their loans, interest and principal, and a small savings component.
What kind of interest rates do they borrow at?
It's 20%.
Oh, wow.
It's like
so
credit card.
Yeah.
Right. Which is actually, we're in the microcredit industry. They're very high percentage rates, and that's really because we're taking the bank and we're moving it out to a community where there is no bank. Right. So it's a lot of transaction costs, very high transaction costs. Right. But I think beyond the credit, the immediate needs of those families are also in the area of education. Many of the women, especially women globally, are illiterate. And so they haven't had access to information, which I think is powerful and powerful in development. So we provide educational services for women. Many microcredit organizations around the world do this because you have a group and they've all come together, and let's make it something really of substance when you've come together. And so that we provide education in women's health, in leadership and community and business development, but then also as a next level, we look to the children and provide some access to education for those children. It's really the idea of alleviating poverty over generations.
Sure. Where does the money come from? Is it from just regular banks, or is it their grants, or?
People just like you, Reggie.
Really?
Right.
Okay.
Mostly through individual loans, but there are granting opportunities. Friendship Bridge in particular doesn't have any government funding, but USAID has done a lot of funding. The Canadian equivalent has done, and many of the European governments provide money for microcredit globally.
Well, Grameen Bank, which is one of the kind of models, sometimes I think in an exaggerated way, but it started out because Professor Yunus, he was a professor at that time at Chittagong University. He felt so moved by the conditions that he just took some of his own money and started, the operation with it. Of course, then, international organizations and others came in and contributed. But by and large, if you look at the macro figures, microcredit organizations in development still have a very substantial portion of their finance coming from the international organizations.
The nice part about microcredit, some of our financing actually comes from our borrowers as well, because they pay interest. They pay 20%.
Right.
So if we get grants, so it's a very low cost of capital, although it takes some money to raise the money, but still, it comes in and then we lend it out at 20%. It actually provides income to our organization. That income stays within Guatemala, but over time, I think it's important for microcredit organizations to really think of themselves to become sustainable over time, meaning that interest should start covering operations down in the country. So it's a strategy that actually generates income for the organizations that do it.
Now, if people want to learn more about Friendship Bridge, do you guys have a website?
We do. It's www.friendshipbridge.org.
Okay. All right, good. Well, we've been talking about world poverty, and we've covered the whole thing in half an hour, so there's really not much more to say. No, this is a topic that we could talk about for 100 days or 100 years and never wrap our minds around it. But hopefully this is a little bit of an introduction into what world poverty is and why it's important for us to be aware of it. I think that altruism drives a lot of people to care about what's happening to other people in parts of the world, and because we have the capacity to make a difference, we feel we have a moral obligation to make a difference. But if that doesn't persuade you, then I think Haider's argument that self-interest should drive it. We need to lift these people out of poverty so they can buy our stuff. And we have stuff to sell on eBay and other places. So thank you very much, Haider, Sue, for being with us. We are out of time tonight. Next week, it's going to get hot in here because we're talking about global warming. We'll see you next week. Global warning might be better. Good evening and welcome to Global Agenda, the show that brings world issues to your doorstep. I'm your host, Reggie Rivers. Now tonight we're going to take an in-depth look at modern China, which, and this may surprise you, is the world's second largest economy. Now, if you're like me, you probably don't know that much about China. Tonight, we'll try to learn more about this huge country on the other side of the globe and perhaps understand better how China fits into the international community and how China's development has and will impact the United States. Please welcome to the show William Wei. He's a professor of history and director of the Sewell Residential Academic Program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's an authority on modern Chinese history and Asian American history, and is the author of Counter-Revolution in China, the Nationalist Jiangxi during the Soviet period, and many other publications. In 1997, he worked as a journalist covering the historic handover of Hong Kong to China. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you. I practiced all that time saying Zhengxi, and then of course I didn't get it right. Also with us is Haider Khan, Professor of International Economics at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's a visiting fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. His areas of expertise are economic theory, international and development economics, and political economy. Professor Khan has written extensively on globalization. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, to start off with, I think that most of us, we don't know that much about China, so we're going to try to get a quick education about this country and what's going on. China recently became #2, the second largest economy in GDP. When did this happen and how did this happen?
The process took a while. It, in fact, took several decades. For almost the last 3 decades, it has experienced significant growth, on average about 9.5%. And this is considered historically to be one of the most rapid developments in a nation's history.
Right.
It has also had all kinds of tremendous implications, for the society of China. And no other nation in history has an estimated 200 million plus people been lifted out of poverty in such a short span of time.
So that's almost the population of the United States lifted
Well,
out
there
of
you go.
poverty.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And
2/3 of the population.
yeah, and China, has to be given a lot of credit for doing this, especially after decades of moribund economic development.
Sure. Now, what are some of the numbers? I know that the United States is an economy of about $10.5 to $11 trillion, but I don't really know any of the other countries.
Well, the Chinese economy is right now more than $2 trillion economy. So yeah, it is a large economy, but European Union as a whole actually is even larger. But European Union is not a country yet, so we can't compare that. Japanese GDP used to be the second largest, but they have fallen slightly behind because of a decade of stagnation and negative growth during some of the years. But in per capita terms, China is still a really low middle income country with a per capita GDP of roughly about $1,500 to $1,700 per capita.
I see.
I should
Compared to, say, the United States, what's...
In the United States, we are way over, probably between 15, 20, maybe even higher than that. I don't have the exact figure. But our poverty line even, and that will give you some idea, is over $18,000, between $18,000 and $19,000 for a family of 4. When we say that people have been lifted out of poverty in China, what we really mean is that there are fewer people living at, say, $2 per day or $1 per day, which is defined as the extreme poverty by the World Bank. But even that is no mean achievement, as has been pointed out. I should mention, however, that there are some doubts about Chinese statistics. And Professor Roski of Pittsburgh has made the point that GDP per capita and growth statistics may be exaggerated. But even if you allow for exaggeration, still I think I'd have to agree with the statement that China has recorded probably the fastest sustained growth ever in the history. Japanese fast growth was pretty fast. That was very impressive also. But that actually was the result of about 80 years of accumulation prior to that. In case of China, I think the foundation of this growth in terms of human resources formation and some basic capital formation, really the foundations were laid in the pre-Deng Xiaoping period, pre-1978 period. People forget that China actually achieved a lot between 1949 and 1978, given all the political turmoil, especially in terms of education, health, basic health, and just allowing people a much more decent standard of living economically, which was lower than it is today for many, but much higher than it was in the pre-revolutionary period.
An interesting thing you mentioned on the 1949 to 1978 period, and when the United Nations was formed and the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council were assigned, China, or at least from my limited understanding, wasn't one of the world's superpowers at the time, but how is it that China had a seat on the Security Council?
It was mainly due to political decisions made during World War II. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for a variety of personal as well as political reasons, wanted China to be a major power. And that would eventually lead to its participation in the United Nations Security Council.
I see.
It is clear that it lacked, as you just pointed out, many of the requirements for being a superpower. And later, that would be a point of contention. And it would have...
Ironically now,
yes,
China's becoming that, while some of the other nations, England and France, who are still on the board, really have less legitimacy to the claim to be on the Security Council.
Yes, it's a legacy of an earlier period. And there are moves to try to reform the United Nations so that it accurately reflects the true distribution of power in the world community.
I should mention that along with China, Brazil, China is already there in the Security Council. Brazil and India and Japan, of course, would like to join them, and in fact is a contender. So Japan, Brazil, and India are 3 kind of leading candidates for membership in the Security Council.
Yes.
Right. Are people afraid of China in the West and China's economic growth, its potential military growth, all of that?
Well, unfortunately, people tend to be historically ambivalent about China. On the one hand, they have embraced the idea of a China market, all those people,
right?
To whom they would like to sell something. And that's only become a reality recently. So on the one hand, they said, oh, we need to have a relationship with a market that large. On the other hand, all those people might constitute a threat as well. So it is a source of ambivalence on the part of people. And people have been focusing on it in recent years. They talk about China as a potential threat, a threat militarily, a threat economically. I would prefer to think of it as a competition, between nations, rather than a situation in which one constitutes a threat to the other.
Let me just reinforce that point and also mention that part of it may be also a legacy of what Edward Said had called quite famously Orientalism. And it applied even to, former Soviet Union. Churchill in 1939, described, he called it Russia actually, that it was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. If anything, people had felt China to be even more of an enigma. Because China is more Oriental. Russia, after all, is European. At least, one half of it or 1/3 of it is literally in Europe. But still, it was not quite understood in the same way as people would understand the West European countries. So there is that problem, but there is also the problem of competition among nations. Churchill knew that too, because he added